Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for the LCK Cup playoffs, the LCK Winter Split playoffs, whatever you want to call it. We are finally in our top 6, and we are finally moving into a full slate of best of 5s. It's been kind of a short road to get here, as it is for every region now that it's split up into 3 different splits, but it's certainly been an interesting one. We, of course, covered the entirety of the group stage, the Group Baron versus Group Elder side of the group stage, where BNK Fear X was the team eliminated. We covered all of the play-ins in one video earlier on this week. You can check that out up in the iCard if you are interested, where we talked about the 3 teams that ended up qualifying here for the playoffs out of that, and now we are finally here at the best of 5s for round number 1. So I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comment section below. What did you expect from these series? What did you expect from these teams? Did things go as you anticipated them to, or were you surprised by some of the outcomes? I will be giving my thoughts and my previews for what I expected from both of these series. Obviously, before we talk about it, we'll go through every single game and, do all the normal playoff stuff, but I'm always curious to hear what general public opinion was and whether or not things went as you anticipated. Spoiler alert, it really did not for me. There were definitely some surprises. The series did not go as I anticipated, regardless of who ended up winning them. Just the general vibe of these series was not what I thought it was going to be, and it certainly is something worth talking about. There was a lot to talk about to take away from these 2 series. So without further ado, let's get right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in the first 2 series that we had here in the playoffs, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of both series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will, of course, be talking about the updated bracket. Selections are out. We know what round number 2 looks like moving forward, and so we will be previewing those series and kind of talking about where I think teams are going to land in the top 4 now that double elimination is kind of in play. But most of today will be spent talking about these round 1 matchups, so let's get into it. Let's get into our first best of 5 in the actual playoffs, not a qualifier. This was a really interesting one on paper because, as I said in my previous video, my play-in video from earlier this week, I think I'm a lot closer to being neutral in terms of favoring one team over the other in this series as opposed to general consensus. It was the number 3 seeded KT Rolster taking on the number 6 seeded NS RedForce. The reason I say that I'm a lot more neutral on this matchup in terms of trying to pick a winner is because I don't see KT Rolster as this dominant team. I think BDD has been a really dominant player, and I think we've seen good signs from players like Perfect, who I think has been generally fine over the course of this year. Cuz I think has been average, maybe a little below average, or just kind of around the middle of the league, but you would expect him to be able to play better. But this is not a ridiculously well-rounded team, and the team that I've honestly compared them to the most that I think they are incredibly similar to is DRX. And what just happened? Well, Nongshim beat DRX pretty handily in a best of 5 in order to qualify for this exact spot. And so I think maybe more so than other analysts, I talked about it in that video, I was kind of expecting this series to be back and forth, to be interesting, for Nongshim to really put up a fight and not just be outclassed. I think people are a bit high on KT because BDD has been one of the best players in the world to start off 2025, but there are genuinely some concerning matchups. Now, that goes back in the favor of KT as well. I think that it's ironic because these 2 teams are kind of the polar opposites of each other in terms of roster construction, where KT is so invested into the middle of their map. Cuz and BDD are very much their star players that they want to try to play through every single game. If you can get BDD into a good spot, if you can get him ahead, he is going to be able to carry you basically in any circumstance. The guy has proven that he deserves to be in the conversation for a top 10 player in the world, and that's what he has been so far. And Cuz is obviously a very experienced player, has a lot of practice playing in these long best of 5s. I'm not expecting him to be, completely out-jungled or anything in a series like this, although we'll talk about it. It's definitely looked a little bit better for Nongshim over the recent weeks, but their strength is the middle of the map, and their weakness is the sides of the map, the side lanes here, top lane and bot lane. Perfect is a good player, but he does have his moments where he just doesn't necessarily stand out. I don't think he's a superstar in terms of the production that he's going to be able to put out there. I don't think he's the problem, though. KT Rolster have the worst bot lane in the LCK. I don't even know if that's really all that debatable. Even a team like Fear X, their strength was bot lane. They just couldn't win anywhere else. The middle of the map was a disaster for them. Topside was a disaster for them, and they were just kind of getting outplayed really hard 5v5. KT's bot lane has just been awful. Dectum has looked pretty miserable, definitely the worst I think he has ever looked at a pro level. I know people have been always low on Dectum, talking about him getting carried by Kellen, getting carried by Peanut, you know, having his career created on that Nongshim team, but he was pretty good on Damwon. People forget that. He was pretty good last year for Fun Plus Phoenix. He was honestly even pretty fine for DRX when that team was an absolute disaster. There were bigger problems than him, and he had his injury anyways. It's shocking to see him be as bad as he has been at the start of this year. He's been a bottom 1, bottom 2 AD carry in the league. And then Wei, another example that I talk about all the time on this channel of rookies just really struggling at the LCK level when things start off. He has been awful. I think he's easily been the worst support in the entirety of the LPL. There have been a couple of players that are fighting it out for that role, but Wei is kind of running away with it at the current moment. So that's definitely a concern for KT Rolster, but their strength is the middle of the map. And why I think that's interesting is that is the polar opposite of Nongshim, who have their strengths in the side lanes. Kingen has been fine, I would say, you know, kind of the opposite of what we kind of know him for. He's been very feast or famine over the course of this split. His good games look tremendously good and his bad games look tremendously bad. Hopefully you can roll pretty highly. He should be a better player than Perfect, but Perfect is generally pretty good at neutralizing top lane, so we'll see what happens there. But it's been Lehens who has been the star of this team, and I think that shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, but it is really nice to see. If this team was going to succeed, Lehens needed to play like one of the best supports in the entire world, and that's exactly what he has been. He has been a dynamic, aggressive, like very, very playmaking-oriented creator for this team. And what I mean by that is he is willing to trade his life over and over and over again if it means getting Nongshim resources. He wants to go into the 15-20 minute part of the game just up 1k gold with the hope and prayer that they can just close out the game from that point onwards, because I think he realizes that the rest of this team is just not mechanically talented enough to generate those resources on their own. So Lehens has really been exceptionally good. I think Jiwoo's been pretty solid as well. He's been a very good like follow-up AD carry. He doesn't necessarily create himself, but he doesn't need to on this team. If you're talking about the concern for Nongshim at the beginning of the year, it was always the middle of the map. Gideon and Fisher were just by far the most unproven mid-jungle duo in the entire league, and at least recently, they've actually been pretty good. Gideon in particular is a really good player. He's playing better than Cuz is right now, and that's where I think KT could really struggle. If Gideon comes out and has a really good series, that's going to point it in the direction of Nongshim for me. But if you're looking for a negative, you know, I just don't expect Fisher to be able to hang with BDD. He's been okay against the other mid laners that aren't quite as good, and he was good against UCal in their best of 5 that got them this spot, and so that is a really encouraging trait because I think UCal is around the level of where BDD is at right now, but I just wouldn't expect Fisher over the course of a best of 5 to be able to hold up against, you know, one of the better players in the world. This is a guy who was absolutely running it nowhere close to top 10 in the LPL last year and wasn't particularly good when he came over back to the LCK. The fact that he's even in the playoffs is a bit of a surprise considering where he has been the past year or so, and so we'll see how he ends up adapting, but the roles are very clear. If Nongshim's going to win, it's likely going to be Lehens and Kingen and Jiwoo popping off, maybe even Gideon really stepping up and being the better jungler. If KT is going to win, it's likely going to be because the middle of the map is just the strongest point on the map for anybody in this series, which is super realistic. That Cuz and BDD are just the two best players in the series and can end up taking over. Again, I think both of these things are equally as possible. You hear a lot of people talking about how KT should be favorites. You know, I was very extensive in my play-in video about how I think Nongshim should not be underestimated here, but the only way to find out who ends up winning these series is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Nongshim RedForce. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up 1-0 in this series. And, you know, picking up game 1 is pretty ginormous in a best of 5 like this, especially because these teams have had so little time to get stage experience. I think being able to get that momentum early, only having to win 50% of the final 4 games does make things a lot less complicated for teams, and it does increase a lot of the overall, I guess, strategies that these teams can employ. But for KT, unfortunately, we're starting to see those weaknesses really come back to bite them in a pretty pivotal way. This was a bad game from KT Rolster. They honestly were just outplayed in a couple of notable areas, and everything kind of went right for Nongshim. They got to play their exact game. They got to be as comfortable as they possibly could, and they came out on top because of that. So Let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is pretty obviously going to go to Lehens. This guy is just Nongshim. Like, he is the guy that's going to come out here and, you know, create everything that they are going to capitalize on. Whether you want to give a lot of that credit to Gideon as well, I think it's kind of up to you. The Sejuani was really good this game. I think Kingen was really excellent on the Jace. Jiwoo did a great job of capitalizing on the Kai'Sa. Fisher, I thought, played totally fine here on the Aurora, was generally good in the mid game and you know, opened up the map. Wasn't a problem for Nongshim, which is all he really needs to be. But it's Lehens. Like, he is the star player for Nongshim, and it comes through in games like this where I just don't know if this team would be nearly as successful if you don't have someone like that on the Nautilus moving around the map and constantly looking to create action for the team. You have a lot of movable parts, we'll just say, in this draft. You have the Kai'Sa and the Jace, both of whom I think are really good to be able to try to accelerate even at the expense of, you know, a couple of kills here or there. You are, you know, staring down a Maokai Azir, and so you don't want to go too late, but you should have a lot of the control over the mid game here, and that's exactly what Nongshim had. They were just able to control the map and really dictate the tempo and the pacing of this game, which really favors a lot of their players because it allows them to be as aggressive or as passive as they want to be, and Lehens is the #1 reason for that. Again, I'm not trying to say this is entirely a Lehens diff or anything like that. I think Kingen in particular played really excellent on the Jace in the top lane, but it is very clear that the bot lane is going to be very much in favor of Nongshim in terms of these two facing off against each other, and that is a problem for KT. Jiwoo was very good at being able to follow up on the Kai'Sa. Kai'Sa's kind of your out here. If you do end up getting stuck in the mid game, they didn't, and it didn't really matter, but if you need to be able to get to those 5v5s in the back half, Kai'Sa is obviously a very good champion to be able to capitalize on that, even more so than Varus. The Sedge was super important towards setting things up, and as long as Fisher survives, Nongshim has a ton of prio and pressure, so again, a very standard performance from a team that I think needed to come out and show that they could do it. For KT Rolster on the other side, their flaws have been mega exposed by a lot of teams already earlier on this year, but they're going to come out even more in these best of fives if this is going to be the direction. I like their draft. I think they actually have more options than Nongshim does, generally speaking here. I like Azir plus Varus on this current patch. I do think that, you know, theoretically, if BDD can get ahead here, it should be a pretty easy game for you to close out, and you're not really in that bad of a spot to be able to try to dictate laning phases. The problem comes in the fact that your bot lane is just not as good as Nongshim's bot lane. Lehens was the better player out of all four of these guys. Like, he was the one on the Rift stepping up and actively making the most important plays in this game, and that meant that, you know, if the Varus gets behind and all of a sudden this bot lane is losing, you don't really have the prio in the mid lane because Azir is not going to be pushing that hard. Lehens just has free will, free reign over the entire map, and now you have no AD carry, because Dekdom has been horrible. He's going to get dead of the game here, just another really bad performance. This is the worst bot lane in the LCK. There's genuinely nothing else for me to say about that at this point. These two just have negative synergy together. They're horrible in lane, and both of them individually are performing very poorly mechanically speaking. I don't know what's going on. We've seen Dekdom perform significantly better than this, even recently in the LPL last year. I get that it's a different ball game, and he wasn't like a superstar over in the LPL or anything like that, but he was good enough to be able to expect him to come here and be like a slightly below average AD carry at the absolute worst, but that is not what Dekdom has been. Dekdom has been the worst AD carry in the league, and if that's going to continue, KT is going to have some disasters upon them. It's not like Wei was better, though. Wei also continues to really not impress me. This guy's mechanics are bad. Like, I genuinely don't know what else to say. I get that he's a rookie, but it's very similar to what we talked about with someone like Hambach over on Bro, where it just feels like the things that he was getting away with are not working. He is so scared, and I think a lot of that has been reinforced by the fact that they are bad, that they aren't a very good bot lane, and that they're not winning 2v2. Maybe Dekdom just plays into that naturally because of the play style, or just generally because he's not particularly mechanically talented right now and not showing a lot of upside. Maybe Wei feels scared to go for these more aggressive plays, but this bot lane feels so stagnant, and they're not really doing anything to try to get themselves out of that situation. I think everybody else was generally fine. Honestly, BDD wasn't very good in this game. I think people are going to say that he was a little bit more hard stuck because that's kind of the narrative, but this is probably the weakest game he's played so far in winter. Cuz Perfect, they were whatever. I think Perfect was generally fine. Actually, I'm not going to blame him on the Mbessa. I think that he was probably the most relevant player on KT in this game. Maybe you want to say that that's Cuz. I think that really is up to you, but KT just not really looking better than what their worst version of them is, right? We talked about how they are so similar to DRX in a lot of notable ways. This was a DRX-esque performance where one of their side lanes is just not good enough to be able to hold up regardless of how well mid lane is playing, and they just can't overcome that. And for Nongshim, they're adept at being able to take advantage of that. This team is significantly more well-rounded than we expected, and they showed that off here. But like I said, it's just game number 1. You don't want to freak out too much. It's a big lead for Nongshim because you only have to win 50% of the rest of the games in this series in order to move on. But, you know, if KT ties it up at 1 apiece, we're going into game 3 all tied, and the entire narrative ends up shifting. Then it's a best of 3, which both teams can end up winning. So a big game here for KT. If Nongshim can get that 2-0 lead, that's also ginormous. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Nongshim RedForce. They are going to take game number 2. They are going to go up in this series 2-0, and it's starting to get a little concerning for KT Rolster fans. They've seen this story before, and unfortunately it just feels like the plane is crashing. That week off might have actually just been a gigantic problem for them. I talked about this a bit in my previous play-ins video, but I also talked about this in the comment section. I don't inherently think that getting buys into the playoffs is a good thing, especially for the number 3 seed who has to come out and play a team who's very hot, who has played multiple series, the most games of anybody. Whoever's coming out as the number 6 seed will have played the most games of anybody in the LCK up until that point, and you've had a full week off, and I think that is affecting KT Rolster, and I think it's affecting Nongshim in a positive way, where they've really gotten the chance to grow into the team that they are, to get a lot more comfortable with their composition, and it's really coming to a head right now. Like, they are showing that the veterans that they picked up are incredibly worth it, and KT just doesn't really have answers. They are underperforming in basically every avenue. So again, let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game is going to go to Kingen. Like, he was the best player here in game number 2. He was really good in game 1 on the Jace. I'm really happy to see that the Rumble is like something that teams are willing to pick up. I don't love it on R1. I don't really love it as a blind pick here. Perfect. I think playing Cassante into it, that theoretically should be fine. For the Cassante, Kingen was just better. And that's something that you're going to hear me say a lot throughout this game number 2 review. And it was kind of the case in game 1 as well, where it does feel like KT's drafts are a little bit more cohesive, I'll just say. And honestly, the fact that they're still getting outplayed in so many important ways, like, that's not good. Like, I feel like you should be in a position where you should be able to win these games on blue side, which has proven to be very strong over the course of this year. It's just not happening, and you're getting outplayed in pivotal areas, and Kingen, I think, is a really great example of that. The R1 Rumble really ends up being a big problem for KT in this game, and again, if Kingen is going to show up in the same way that Lehens is going to show up, these were your 2 big off-season acquisitions. The middle of the map was secondary, and you just kind of got who you could get. You built your team around being able to pick up 2, pretty prized free agents, a former world champion and a guy who has been, a first-team All-Pro regular, an MVP at this level in Lehens, and so you wanted to build around them, and they are coming in clutch right now in a very important best-of-5. So credit to Kingen and credit to Lehens, who once again had a really excellent game on the Alistar. This one's much less surprising when you see the comp that KT have. Like, Alistar does some damage if he can get into, certain big situations, if he can actually disrupt a lot of the engages, and that's exactly what Lehens was able to do. The misfortune really got going in the early game. And a lot of that is, again, just Lehens being the best player on the Rift in terms of his mentality and in terms of his mechanics. It's insane. Like, typically speaking, when you see a really good support go to, like, a middle-of-the-table team, like a good team, but maybe not a great team, you don't see them continue to pop off in the same way. Supports are typically more affected performance-wise by their team than a lot of other roles are. But Lehens has completely continued to dominate. Like, this is still top 1 support in the world type of gameplay coming in from Lehens, and that's really cool to see. Jiwoo was really good. Gideon continues to be fine on the Poppy. Fisher was definitely a bit more exposed, I would say, in this game on the Yone, but he's actually playing totally fine. I think we've, definitely seen significantly worse performances from Fisher. The fact that he's even remotely in the conversation with BDD is, again, all he really needs to do. You can rely right now on Kingen and Lehens and Jiwoo and Gideon. Like, these players are all playing incredibly well. If Fisher can just survive, like, that's a huge positive, and that's what he's doing. But, Nongshim just feels like they're clicking, and now they're up 2-0. Now they're in a dominant place to be able to close this series out and not really make it look all that close, and that is disaster for KT Rolster. You are on the brink of having the worst case scenario end up coming to fruition, and that's obviously not ideal for them. But it's not just the bot lane. Like, as much as I'd like to sit here and point out the bot lane, which has been bad, and I agree, they have been bad, like, Cuz has not been good enough this split. He's gonna get done of the game for me here for game number 2 on the Vi. the Vi didn't do anything. Like, you B1 Vi and you go for this pick comp, you really want to try to get Jinx accelerated, and you want to try to take advantage of your gigantic mid-game, like, gap that you have with Vi and Ahri to be able to create plays and try to fight around these objectives, and it just doesn't happen. Cuz is horrible in this game. Like, there is nothing else left to say when it comes to it. I've been kind of playing nice about it for most of this split, saying like, Cuz has just been average to slightly below average, which is, you know, not good enough, and I think that's kind of been true, but maybe it's even been worse than that. Like, this really has been BDD and 4 wards, and Cuz is a part of that. I think people are expecting him to be able to turn it around, and people are expecting to get better performances. They've just not been there so far in 2025, so we'll see if things get better, because right now they're not particularly good. Again, the bot lane's not great. Like, they're still the weak part of this team, but you're playing, you know, Jinx Leona into Misfortune Alistar. That's not entirely unanticipated, especially when you know that you're the worst of these two bot lanes. A very greedy selection there, but Dectum has always wanted to go for these more late game carries. I think Perfect had a much worse game here in game 2 than he did in game 1, and BDD was fine, but I think the scoreline is still better than maybe the individual performance would indicate. KT just got outplayed once again in this one. It never felt like they had control. It never felt like they had pressure, and in that circumstance, like, Nongshim should be the one that's getting praised. They're one game away from sweeping KT Rolster out of the playoffs and making top 4. Top 4 would be a gigantic achievement for an organization that has really been struggling in recent years. They go all in 2022 and it fails, and so they go for a youth movement in 2023 and 2024, and that also fails. This is kind of the culmination of them trying to dig their way out of a gigantic hole, and they are, again, one game away from making top 4. KT wants to do anything other than get swept. Game 3 is obviously mega important. If they lose it, their winter split is over, but we could be seeing the end of our first playoff series in a 3-0 sweep. Is that going to happen? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Nongshim RedForce. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to take this series in a 3-0 sweep, and they will be moving on to round 2 and thus gaining an extra life here in the playoff bracket. KT Rolster is unfortunately eliminated because of that fact, but again, I'm not entirely surprised by this outcome. I think a lot of people were shocked to see Nongshim come out on top because KT was looked at pretty favorably coming out of the, like, regular season, the group stage, whatever you want to call it, but I just didn't really see that same thing in KT. It very much felt like a top 4 and then a cluster of everybody else after that, and that was very clear here. I think KT is a very flawed team in the same way that DRX is a very flawed team, where you can't just have one player that's really good. Everybody has to step up, and unfortunately that just wasn't the case here. Nongshim is so well-rounded, though. It does feel like this team is really starting to click, and honestly, this was a fantastic game 3. In my opinion, their best game of the entire series. So let's talk about it. Player of the game and player of the series for me as a whole is going to go to Kingen in the top lane, this time on the Ornn. He was phenomenal, and honestly, if you wanted to give player of the series to Lehens, I would totally respect that as well. The Rakan was absolutely excellent in this game, but really, truly, like, Kingen was a difference maker. This was worlds-winning Kingen showing up once again. This guy always performs well in best of 5s. It's actually pretty crazy, the historic track record that he's had on that, regardless of the team that he's been on, and that has absolutely continued here for Nongshim. He showed up here today and completely outplayed Perfect, and Perfect was not the biggest problem on KT. I think jungle and bot were definitely the biggest problems on KT, but Perfect was horrible here in game number 3. He definitely let the team down on the Renekton, was not useful in any way, and Kingen very much took advantage of that, obviously being able to pick up the Ornn to be able to slow the pace of the game down. That was generally the idea, in my opinion, behind the Nongshim draft. You're looking at Corki, you're looking at Ezreal, you're looking at Lilia, Ornn, you're looking for these 5v5s, right? You are looking for the late game, you are trying to get past this early problem that could be created with Nidalee potentially trying to run the early map. The problem is that Nidalee was horrible in this game, and that means that even the early game advantage that KT is supposed to have wasn't necessarily an advantage. You try to get the best of both worlds with this draft, drafting the Renekton Nidalee and trying to combo off of that early, but then drafting Zeri, Tristana, like double AD carry to try to give you an out in the later half of the game, and unfortunately it just meant that you weren't really doing either particularly well, and again, Kingen took advantage of that by just becoming unkillable on the Ornn. Really great series from him overall. Like I said, Lehens was also phenomenal on the Rakan. He is the best creator in the world, like the best playmaker. I'm pretty confident in saying that. On is certainly up there as well. I think he is the other player that you definitely look at for that role. You know, Delight, I think, is definitely in there, but Delight does a lot of other things really well. Lehens is just the pure, unbridled like combination of aggression and confidence, and it comes out in every single game that he gets to play these flashy supports on. He's just awesome. Like, there's nothing else I can say to hype up Lehens in the way that I haven't already. The progression that he has made as a player ever since like getting to Gen G the first time, that first split on Gen G when he was playing with Ruler was so exceptional. He goes to KT Rolster, wins the MVP there, goes back to Gen G, looks exceptional, is here on Nongshim, looks exceptional right now. Ever since 2022, this guy has become the best support in the world, or arguably the best support in the world, and that is continuing even on a team that probably won't be able to back that up throughout the rest of the year. But I think the big positive for me is just how good Fisher was in this game number 3. I mean, BDD was really good on the other side of this. Like, the Zeri was definitely the strength of KT, and he was the win condition. This felt a lot more like a KT Rolster-esque performance for, you know, just the entire team playing through BDD in the middle of the map, but Fisher survived and was super useful in the back half. He generally was better than BDD throughout the beginning part of this series as well, and so that's awesome. Again, he's your weak link. If he's going to show up, that's huge. Gideon has been exceptionally good. We talked about if he was better than Cuz, that's just game over for KT, and it was, and Jiwoo's a great follow-up here, even if he's not necessarily like a superstar. He's not somebody that I'm expecting to break into the top 3 or 4 AD carries in the LCK. He's certainly good enough to be able to capitalize on, you know, what Lehens is creating. Nongshim just feels really in sync right now, and what we're seeing is that more well-rounded teams are just generally better than a team like KT Rolster that relies on forcing the best player on the Rift to be the best player every single game. It's just not all that consistent. So credit to Nongshim, and credit against KT Rolster. Like, this team has major adjustments that they're going to need to fix. This is not right now a top 5 team in the LCK. I think that has become abundantly clear. Maybe top 6 if you really wanted to put them over a team like DRX or any of the other teams that are below them, but they have clear flaws, and their bot lane is atrocious. Like, Wei is awful. He is clear choice for dud of the game. This is a horrible Rel performance. I understand this is a very difficult game to play Rel into because you're trying to be a primary engage option against Corki, Ezreal, and Lilia, and Ornn, and it's like, okay, well, what am I supposed to do this game? How exactly am I supposed to execute any of my abilities against this team comp? But at the end of the day, this guy's mechanics are just bad. Like, it is clear that he does not have the skill right now to be able to execute on a lot of the plans and the setup ideas that KT Rolster has, and that's just a problem. Like, that is a major issue for KT moving forward. Cuz was awful in this series. I mean, like, truly bad. He got completely outplayed by Gideon, and honestly, he kind of outplayed himself. He was given so much responsibility in this Game 3 draft and did absolutely nothing with it. Perfect was bad, like, nothing else to really say. Had his worst game of the series by far in Game 3. Even if BDD was the strength of this team, like, he still wasn't, like, dominant. He wasn't popping off and carrying the game and, like, you know, actively dominating team fights. I do think it was closer in Game 3 than it was in Games 2 and 1, but still not enough, and Dectum's not been particularly good. KT has major real issues, and I think they were just brought to the surface here in this 3-0 clean sweep in the playoffs. I think these had always been there. It's just Nongshim is actually a team that can take advantage of those problems, and KT has a lot of things they need to clean up. This is not a particularly good-looking team at the current moment, and if they continue on this trajectory, they're probably just going to be bottom half the entire rest of the year. But massive win for Nongshim. Getting into the top 4 is, whether you want to consider it deserved or not, pretty incredible. Like, I get that T1 and Hanwha Life probably are the other 2 top 4 teams, but the fact that you are going to be there, get the championship points for that, and, you know, have the double elimination, like, extra life that you get in this bracket, it's just going to give you more best of 5s against some of the best teams in the world to hopefully get players like Gideon and Jiwoo to be even better moving forward. Like, you've got to be optimistic right now about Nongshim. This is an upper half team in the LCK, and that is certainly not something I was expecting going into the year. But then moving on now to our second series of round number 1, and this was the one that everybody was waiting for, the one that everybody was so excited about. These are likely 2 of the top 4 teams in the entire region. Unfortunately, one of them will have to be eliminated here in round number 1. It's a matchup between the number 4 seeded T1 and the number 5 seeded Hanwha Life Esports. Very intriguing to see these 2 teams matched up against each other. Of course, this was like a really hyped matchup earlier on in the year. People were so excited to see when these 2 teams inevitably clash. They wouldn't get the chance to do so in the regular season in the group stage because The way the group format obviously worked meant that they were both in Group Baron, which means that they would never play each other in the regular season, but now we finally get a chance to see where these two teams stand. They're coming in with very different perceptions, at least from me. Ironically enough, in that play-ins video when I kind of previewed these round 1 series, I said that this was the one that I had a better grasp on in terms of expectation, because honestly, I think T1 is just going into this series as the better team so far in 2025. I think they have shown a lot more versatility. I think they have shown a lot more consistency, and I've been real concerned with what Hanwha Life has put out on the Rift in terms of their actual results, but that doesn't mean that I don't think they can compete in a series like this. These are obviously two of the most talented teams in the world, and when you look at how they match up against each other, obviously a lot of eyes and a lot of fingers are going to be pointed at the top lane matchup, because these are two top laners that just switched teams from the end of last year. That's basically the only change that either of these two rosters ended up going through. Now T1 obviously is a new AD carry, but we'll talk about that in a second. Zeus versus Doran is definitely the matchup to watch out for. And, you know, generally speaking, on paper, like, Doran has gotten the better end of this matchup over the past couple of years. Zeus has honestly had a bit of a kryptonite in Doran, especially in these best of fives domestically, that he's not really been able to overcome. It is a different circumstance now. Obviously, Doran is, we'll just say a little bit more unlocked than he typically was on a team like Hanwha Life, and he's definitely playing a lot more aggressive with T1, which I think is a positive, but could also be a negative. Zeus is known for being able to take advantage of these top laners that are pushing up a little bit too far. You give Zeus an inch and he is going to take a mile, and so that could be a way for Zeus to get back on track after what has been a pretty slow start to 2025 on his new team. We know he's talented enough to be able to make this work, but I would expect top lane to actually be in favor of T1 because of that historical precedent that Doran has set. As for the rest of the team, when you're looking at strengths for T1, at least right now, jungle definitely looks like a strength. Owner has been better than Peanut throughout basically all of the winter split so far, the LCK Cup, and hopefully that ends up continuing for T1, because Owner being able to step up and actually being a primary option for this team as both a carry and a facilitative piece, like, it's ginormous for opening up, you know, more other lanes, I guess you can say, to capitalize on that, to have more resources. Someone like Smash has done really well being strong side for T1, and a lot of the reason that that has succeeded for them is because Owner has been a lot better at playing facilitators so far, playing champions that can kind of be isolated from the rest of the team early on and make more of an impact in the mid game. I think he's done really well in that role. Of course, it's Faker. Like, you expect him to be able to show up for these best of fives, but you never really know which version of him you're going to get domestically. It's always a bit of a coin flip, and, you know, that I think is still going to be looked at as a strength, but him and Zeka, I think, have performed relatively similarly, and so when you kind of boil down T1's strengths, right now, the top side of the map looks like a strength, or I would expect to be a strength in this series. Owner, I think, is going to be a primary force for T1 so long as Peanut plays the way that he did in the, like, group stage and so far in 2025, and I think Doran, you know, has Zeus's number, historically speaking, domestically, in these best of fives, and so that's where I would expect T1's biggest advantages to come in. But for HLE, it's not like they're just without ways to be able to equalize that. First of all, it's not like it's guaranteed for the top side to even lose for HLE. Zeus and Peanut on paper should be better than Doran and Owner. Like, we expected them to be better going into the year, and so if they end up showing up here and being the better, like, top jungle duo, well, all of a sudden, that's T1's biggest advantage that's just no longer there. They've not performed like that so far in 2025, and so, you know, I'm kind of leaning against that, but it's definitely still a possibility. Peanut's arguably the greatest jungler of all time, or at least the most accomplished jungler of all time, and Zeus, we know what he's capable of doing. This is a multiple-time world champion, and so you definitely can't count either of them out. I also think that people are really underselling how good Delight has been at the start of this year. He's, like, been world-class in the support position, regardless of the inconsistencies that HLE is going through. The thing I've always talked about with HLE, at least so far in 2025, has been that you will always find 2 or 3 players that are playing up to, like, their own standards, that are playing world-class level, and then randomly there's always, like, 1 or 2 players on the team that are just running it every single game for absolutely no reason. Delight has not been one of those guys. He has been consistent and solid and strong for this team basically every game that they've played, and so the typical advantage that T1 has with Keria in the support position being this gigantic playmaker, like, I think Delight can absolutely equalize that. I think that's a big positive for HLE. Zeka, I think, is also in decently good form. Mid lane's just incredibly strong in the LCK. I would generally favor his tape over Faker's so far in 2025, although I think it's incredibly close, and Viper's also infinitely more experienced than someone like Smash in these long best of fives that could potentially take place should this go to game 4 or game 5. So Definitely could see some avenues for both of these teams, but I would favor T1. I would actually favor them decently heavily going into this series. We'll see if that ends up panning out. The only way to know how this series ends up going is, of course, to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take the first game. They're gonna go up 1-0. And like I said, in the first series, it's gigantic to win game number 1. It is absolutely ginormous for you to be able to establish that momentum early in a series and just be able to say, well, I only have to win 50% of the final 4 games at absolute worst in order to move on to the next round. And I think generally the way that they did it in this game was pretty encouraging. Kind of a slow game, very LCK oriented, like old school LCK oriented game, much more macro oriented, where you're not really getting a lot of aggressive, crazy plays. I think both drafts kind of set up for that. Bot lane for T1 was definitely a little bit different. They really wanted to try and snowball the game out of control through the pike, but Keria did not have a particularly good game. The bot lane for T1 took a really bad trade very early on, and basically from that point onwards, the Ezreal and the Alistar were able to just kind of run the laning phase, and you're looking at a comp that I think is just a tad bit more consistent for HLE, even if I think both of these drafts are totally fine. So we can get into it. Player of the game is, at least in my opinion, pretty obviously going to go to Zeus on the top side. We talked about how he needed to step up, about how he needed to be better than Doran on the other side of this, kind of buck the trend that he has established over the past couple of years domestically, and he did that in game number 1. We finally got a situation where top lane's not lane swapped for HLE, and Zeus can actually just go 1v1 against somebody else on the top side. And yes, Jace is generally going to be much stronger than Mbessa in the laning phase, but for him to generate as large of a lead as he was able to generate, it just was utter domination in the 1v1. This is the Zeus that we had kind of been waiting for, and I'm so glad that he was able to deliver in that sense in game number 1 here. They need him to be able to step up. Like I said, he's a big turning point for whether or not this series is going to be easy or difficult for Hanwha Life. If he's going to be able to show up and win in lane, be better than Doran, that's going to really simplify the process for basically everything else that HLE want to do. I do want to give a big shout out to the bot lane as well. Like I said earlier, T1 kind of threw away the game with their bot lane losing very early on. Viper and Delight were the ones to capitalize on that, and they were excellent throughout the rest of this game as well. Delight's engages are just so consistent, so fun to watch. He is very quickly, like, ascending up the ranks of best support in the world. He has been for a little while now, but I think he's the best player on Hanwha Life over the course of 2025, which is a super important statement to make because it's not like everybody else has been absolutely disastrous. I genuinely just think Delight has been that good, and his Alistar followed that up here. Viper was solid on the Ezreal. Again, also very important as a part of the equation. Love the Azir into Aurora matchup. I don't think that's particularly easy to play for a blind pick Aurora. The good thing for T1 is that Zeka's Azir is now out of the way, and he won't get to play that again. And Peanut was also fine on the Xin Zhao. Owner didn't do anything in this game, which we will talk about. HLE just kind of playing slow, playing calm, cool, collected, letting their gold lead just skyrocket up, and then eventually pulling the trigger on being able to close things out. They got a small lead early and then just never allowed T1 back into the game. This was very prototypical for HLE, but for T1 on the other side, I am going to kind of complain because I do think there were opportunities for them to attempt to get back into the game, but they were just so slow and so passive that they never really tried to get back into the game, which I think is definitely a bit frustrating for T1. You don't really see them often employ the do nothing and lose strategy. It's not really a T1 thing to do, especially once they drafted things like Vi, which is like free hard engage, Pike, which is obviously something that they really wanted to play around. Like, you have a lot of tools here to try and figure something out to get back into the game. They just didn't really try and execute on any of that. They got in a gold deficit early and then just kind of bled out until they lost. Dead of the game for me is going to go to Keria on that Pike. I love Keria's Pike, and I do think it's a very strong pick, but when he throws away the game at level 1, like, it's going to be pretty bad. He kind of ran it down a couple of times after that as well. Just not a very good game number 1 from Keria. I expect that he's going to be a lot better throughout the rest of this series, but this was not a very good tone establisher, we'll just say. And again, this draft is very focused on being able to play around Pike engages, and so if you don't have that, if the Pike is entirely useless and super far behind, it's not really all that good. Like, a 4v5 without the Pike is pretty difficult to win for T1, as we saw. I also really want to criticize Owner. Like, going 0-1-0 and being 0-0-0 for, like, a majority of this game on Vi while your team is losing is just completely unacceptable. Like, at some point, you have to pull the trigger and attempt to make a play. This was something I criticized Owner for a lot last year and in years prior, where it just doesn't feel like he is a game breaker on his own. He kind of needs others to make plays that he can follow up on in order to feel like an elite player. It felt like he was starting to get rid of that. He was awesome at Worlds, and he definitely didn't have that reputation at Worlds, and he's been pretty good at the start of 2025. I felt pretty confident saying that he had finally ascended into being one of those guys that you could talk about in the top, 10 players in the world, but this was the owner of old, just back, doing nothing because the rest of his team was losing, because top lane was losing, because bot lane was losing. He just felt like he couldn't make any plays, which is not really the circumstance you want to be in. I don't really love blind pick Aurora here for Faker. Zeka's Azir is really good, and Azir is really good into Aurora, and it ended up being a problem. Faker couldn't impact the game at all. Smash obviously was part of that early death, early loss in the bot lane that ended up really setting them behind, and then Doran just got absolutely clobbered in the laning phase. T1 was definitely the worst of these two teams in game number 1. The only bit of reprieve that I think I can give them is that it honestly felt like it was over super early on, that they had just mentally given up on game number 1. They're going to need to equalize here in game number 2. If they go down 0-2 to Hanwha Life, that's a pretty horrible place to be, especially with the mental aspect coming out of game number 1. But for HLE, pretty nice win. Do need to see what happens when they face really any sort of resistance. It, again, felt like T1 kind of gave up on the game halfway through. We'll see if that happens more so throughout the rest of the series. Something tells me it won't, but HLE needs to keep their foot on the gas. 2-0 would be ginormous. 1-1 just makes it a best of 3, which you're still not favorited in. So big game number 2 for both of these teams. Which of them is going to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was T1. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to even up the series at 1 apiece, and this was a much, much better performance from them as opposed to what we got in game number 1. Whatever we got in game number 1, that just was not looking great. This was a pretty clean effort, I would say, all things considered, from T1. Basically, all around, you can sing some of the praises. I really like their draft. Not that I hate Hanwha Life's, I hate it for them in particular, but I think T1 drafted exactly what they needed to, which was real solid outs in the late game, like actual team fighting tools. Obviously Victor, Wukong, Rumble, there were so many things here, while also giving yourself real options in the early game. Jhin is like a notorious counter to Ashe. This is like a long-term, counter to Ashe. I remember back in like 2016, 2017, that was like the full conversation. Jhin is obviously still a champion that can still really work, and I think Poppy is just insanely valuable. This is not the most valuable Poppy game of all time in terms of what the enemy has. There are definitely games where it's going to be a bit more dominant, but being able to take that pick away from Hanwha Life for not only this game, but the rest of the series, as well as, having Keria on something that can be a bit more consistent than the Pyke was in game number 1, I think that's also a pretty major positive. For HLE on the other side, just bad execution, a really, really horrible game out of Peanut in the jungle, which we will talk about, really put them behind in the early game. And once T1 got a gold lead, like, their comp is just so good at being able to execute later on in the game that it was going to be very difficult for them to ever throw this one away, and they were able to end it. So I don't think it's the worst thing in the world for HLE, because you did just have one player, play really poorly and put you in a gigantic hole, but I do think there are some things to still be concerned about. For T1, I do want to kind of sing praises of basically everybody. I think you could point to 3 players in particular that really stood out. The first one for me being my player of the game, Faker in the mid lane, was really excellent on the Victor. He is like absolutely hard carrying Victor's win rate in the LCK right now. He is, I think, 5 of Victor's 6 wins in the LCK at the current moment, and so he's definitely favored the champion. We're not really seeing this level of success from Victor elsewhere. The LEC is really the only other region that's even trying out the champion at like an extended, level, and even then it's not nearly as much as T1 is. Faker sees something in Victor that gives him some consistency in the back half of the game, and obviously it very much works for him. He was super valuable here. The Victor W's were genuinely really important in these close quarter fights for being able to separate a lot of key figures from their counterparts on HLE. You have Zyra, who's low mobility, Hui, who's low mobility, Ashe, who's low mobility. Like, the gravity fields are actually ginormous this game, and, causing these, like, close quarter fights to become even more dangerous already with the wombo of, like, Wukong plus Rumble just makes it very difficult to deal with on the side of HLE. Faker did a great job there. I want to give a big shout out to Smash. He was much better here in game number 2. Definitely felt a lot more comfortable on the Jhin. This is a pretty decent matchup. If you isolate it, I don't think, you could really take advantage of it too much. Jin's not necessarily the kind of champion that you can dominate lane with in the same kind of way that other counter matchups in the bot lane would typically lead you to do, but Smash was really good in the middle part of this game, the mid game, if you will, on the Jhin, and I think that's definitely something I want to exert. Doran had some phenomenal ultimates this game. You can excuse one in the mid lane that was a little bit suspect, but outside of that, like, Doran's ultimates were genuinely fantastic, and they comboed off of Faker incredibly well. Owner was good on the Wukong. Keria was super important on the Poppy, especially in the back half for forcing a lot of these close quarter fights and really getting rid of a lot of other counter tools that HLE would have. Generally, this is just a really well-played game from T1 overall. You can't really point to any of their members and ask for anything more. I still don't love B1 Rumble, but it's turning out really good so far today in these best of five, so we'll see if that ends up continuing, but just a much cleaner, much more T1-esque game. This is the team I expected to show up in this series. And then for HLE on the other side, like, Peanut ran it. Like, there's no real other way to say it. He's gonna get done of the game. He was really awful here in game 2. Peanut's concerning me. His winter split has not been good. Like, there's honestly no other way to talk about it. He has been kind of the player on the team that's been hyper inconsistent. I know we've pointed out Zeus as well, not necessarily being great, but Owner just kind of was given free passes in this game to be able to get to those mid-game spikes that Wukong really loves, because Peanut was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He's never been particularly good at these, like, scaling AP carries. Wasn't good on Zyra and Brand last year. He's, like, historically bad on things like Nidalee, and so, you know, I don't necessarily think this is super out of character for Peanut. I'm honestly just surprised that they ended up drafting it for him in the first place, especially not even putting Zeka on, like, an AD carry in the mid lane. I know that, you know, Yone was banned, and, you know, Corki was also banned, and I assume that that was a bit of a backup option, but Zeka can play quite a few of the ADCs in the mid lane, as well as a lot of, like, obviously the AD bruisers as well, the AD assassins. There were options here that they didn't want to go for. They ended up going for the Hui. The Hui's not the problem here. Zeka was not the issue this game. Zeus definitely had a much worse game than he did in game number 1. The Cassante should be able to run a lot of the mid to late game here, and he just was not useful in really any way. Viper, I don't think, was particularly good on the Ashe. Again, kind of got counterpicked here by the Jhin, but you probably should have seen that one coming with an R1 Ashe, and Delight was fine, but also not particularly exceptional. If you're leading the team in kills as Leona, you're probably doing something wrong. At the very least, the rest of your team is definitely doing something wrong. It just felt like T1 completely outclassed HLE in this one. I think there were ways for them to be relevant if Zyra didn't completely run it down, but that's not the circumstance we found ourselves in. HLE basically threw away game 2 off the back of Peanut not playing well, and now the series is tied up at 1 apiece. We're going into game number 3, 1-1, which means this is now the most important game of the entire series. Winning game number 3 means that you only have to win one of the final 2 games. Having to do that versus having to win both is a gigantic advantage, and also the mental that you get from just being up in the series is ginormous. We'll see if the blue side success continues here, and if HLE can pull back the win, or if T1 can show that game 1 was definitely more of an outlier. We'll find out right now, because the winner of game number 3 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go back up in this series 2-1 and take full control once again, just kind of capitalizing on T1's mistakes. Instead of T1 being super inactive and not really having a lot to do throughout a lot of the mid game like they did in game number 1, though, you have a situation where they are kind of trying to pressure something and trying to play out through their, you know, busted mid laner, and it just doesn't really end up working. Hanwha Life just played better throughout basically the entirety of the early game, and that allows them to stretch out their lead into a pretty clean end in 34 minutes. Once again, a very good game from HLE. I would argue that these games so far, like the first 2 wins, especially game 1 and game 3, they're probably the 2 best games that HLE has played all year long. Like, I know they've won, like, games, you know, 4-2. They weren't like an absolute disaster in the group stage, and you go on and you win that best of 3 against DRX, you know, pretty handily, I would say, even if there were some things to be a bit concerned about, but it had never really felt like they were dominant, right? It never felt like they were living up to that top 1, top 2 hype that they were supposed to have. This is really the first time that we're seeing that version of that team, where all 5 members are kind of playing within sync, playing within unison, and I think it is a really good sign that it's happening against a really good team in T1. Maybe it just took some time for them to, you know, level up and get used to playing with each other again, or alternatively, maybe they were just, you know, not taking it as seriously in the main season, and now you're playing T1 in a best of 5 in the playoffs, you are taking it more seriously, because it was the player that I had been complaining about for the most part on HLE that stepped up and dominated this one. Peanut in the jungle is going to get player of the game. You know, I criticized his Nidalee, I think literally in the previous game. I said, oh, he's not very good at AP junglers, you know, things like Zyra, Brand, Nidalee, like they're just not the champions he's very comfortable on, and Kiri picks Nidalee and just absolutely dominates. It's actually super funny to see this happen, because Peanut, again, has never really been all that interested in playing champions like this, at least historically speaking, and so to see him pop off so much against against T1 when he is struggling, playing some of the worst League he's played in quite a while. Not that he's been like the biggest disaster, just that the expectations for Peanut are out of this world. This guy has been nothing but a top 2 or 3 jungler in the world for the past, half a decade, maybe even longer. And so for him to start off, relatively slow, it wasn't exactly what you were anticipating, we'll just say, from Peanut, but coming out here in Game 3 and just kind of running it on the Nidalee, having a fantastic performance. It's exactly what you really wanted to see individually from him. So a really nice game from Peanut. I want to give a big shout out to Zeus as well. Continues to play really well in the top side. I think Aurelia into Gnar is obviously a pretty decently favorable matchup for Aurelia, and T1 is clearly putting at least a little bit of priority into trying to get Doran into something comfortable so that he can take over. In the 1v1, as it would turn out, it's not necessarily Doran beats Zeus, it's T1 top laners just randomly losing best of 5 series in good matchups. Like, this is the exact opposite of what has happened, historically, domestically, that Doran has been able to beat Zeus even when he's not necessarily in these best lane matchups. Well, now it's flipped on its head, and Zeus is the one kind of coming out on top and being super useful on the Gnar. Still really like how Viper and Delight are playing. Delight picks up the Pantheon support, definitely outplayed the other support on the other side of the map. We will get to that. Viper continues to be super consistent, and Zeka gets his best champion, even though Faker is going in with the Mel, our first ever Mel on this channel that we are going to cover. Even though Faker is pulling out this champion that a lot of people are calling incredibly busted, Zeka is able to turn that matchup for the most part, even with Faker playing really well and being pretty valuable. Zeka was also very valuable. This just was a very good team effort, I would say, all things considered, for HLE, and the fact that Peanut in particular was the one to step up and really push them forward, it's a very encouraging trait because he has been their most inconsistent player all year long. And then for T1, you really cooked with this draft. You might have overcooked a little bit. I like the idea behind it, and I do think, in certain circumstances, I could see a world in which this draft ends up working out. You just didn't really get the execution off. Keria is once again going to get dud of the game. Support LeBlanc is going to be basically everything everyone talks about, like that and the Mel pick from Faker coming out here in this game. Support LeBlanc has been picking up steam like a lot in solo queue. It's been pretty highly played for the last like 4 or 5 months. This is just really the first time we are seeing it in a major pro region, especially in such a pivotal spot. But with Fearless, like, you want to play something aggressive. He already showed that he wanted to play the Pyke in this series. I understand why he might want to pull it out, but man, did it not work. You need to snowball the game on support LeBlanc, especially with something like Misfortune in the lane with you. You need to be able to go into that mid game with as much prio as possible, and, credit to Viper and Delight, they didn't really allow that to happen, and then Peanut got a gigantic lead for HLE. That snowball just was not existing. It was non-existent, I'll just say, for T1, and Keria was just useless the rest of the game. He actively inted in multiple occasions. It's not been a particularly good series for Keria. He needs to play better if this team is going to step up, but Smash was also really horrible in this game. I think his mechanics really started to get exposed a bit. Viper really was outplaying him in a lot of these skirmishes. Smash also needs to play better. The spot lane in general was just not very good in this game. Doran, I think, again, also needs to step up. He was super aggressive throughout a lot of this game, but he's in a fantastic matchup for him, and the team clearly wanted to invest into giving him something to feel comfortable with. He was expected to be able to win on the top side here, and he's just not really been able to do that. Owner was basically non-existent in this game on the Sejuani. I'm not blaming him. I don't think this was his fault, but Peanut definitely, grabbed the reins at the start of this game and never really let go. And then, of course, Faker on Mel. This champion's pretty crazy to watch at the pro level, but we are also seeing some of the funny little interactions. My tweet that I put out when Mel first came out was, I think this champion is going to absolutely dumpster low elo, solo queue, things like that, and I think it's going to be less useful in pro play because I think teams are just going to be more calculated with how they play around her gigantic cooldown on her Reflect. Like, she doesn't really have a ton of safety outside of that. There are ways to punish a champion like Mel, and we kind of saw that. That being said, Faker was still very relevant in this game and by far the best player for T1. Mel still looks like she can be a champion that takes over. We'll see if more people start to pick her up. She's been disabled in a lot of the regions and not playable yet in a lot of the regions. We'll see what happens when she actually genuinely becomes a pick that people can start playing, if that champion is just going to be one of the highest priority mid laners in the game. I'm kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out on that idea because, again, I think she's counterable in certain circumstances, but Faker definitely showed the strengths of the champion here. Overall, T1 just needs to get more consistent at playing playing out like their draft. If you're going to pick something super greedy and aggressive like Aurelia plus LeBlanc support, you have to be able to snowball the game, and they just weren't able to do that. If you want something that's going to be a bit more, high floor, you don't have to execute so much on in the early game, don't pick this draft. Like, that is really the end of the story. And then for HLE, they're looking really good. Again, I would argue this is the best they have looked all year long. Specifically, this is the best that Peanut has looked all year long, and that is super essential towards their success. But is that going to be able to continue? Are they going to be able to close this out and kind of pull off a bit of an upset here by winning in 4? Or is T1 going to take that game number 4 and push us to a Silver Scrapes game number 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was T1. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to tie up the series at 2 apiece, and for the first time here in 2025, at least in the playoffs, we are going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. I'm so excited to see what these two teams can do in a game 5, a do-or-die full fearless game 5. There is a lot of possibilities to talk about for that, but of course we got to go through game number 4 first, talk about how we got there and what I think we can take away from it. T1 obviously just playing a much more straightforward comp. In my opinion, they've really got a lot of tools, I think, to take advantage of. You've got the Karma Caitlyn lane that you can really capitalize on early because the Elise really needs to get the ball rolling very quickly into the game. As we all know, if she's not snowballing the game out of control, then she's not particularly useful as a support. We will talk about that. And bot lane was definitely a massive strength for T1 in this one, but you also have a lot of late game outs. Viego is obviously a really great team fight champion. You've got a lot of ways to control the map and split push with things like Jax and Ahri in side lanes. Like, there are just a lot of options, I would say, overall for T1 in this draft. Not that I hate HLE's draft, and honestly, not that I hate how HLE played this game. They're playing entirely around the Diana Yasuo Wombo combo in the back half with, the hope that Corki can be kind of the secondary follow-up damage in that regard. And you know what? In certain circumstances, it really did end up working out. The Diana Yasuo was a pretty major problem for T1, and we definitely saw the strength of the middle of the map, but bot lane was just an absolute disaster for HLE. They ended up losing them this game, which is definitely unfortunate because they felt like the strongest part of this team for a little while. But let's go ahead and get into the specifics, of course, starting with player of the game, which to me is going to go to Doran in the top lane. I think this is up for debate. Owner, obviously, with a pretty big masterclass in the back half of this. I think Smash and Keria were also really good. Really, the only player that I didn't consider for player of the game was Faker, and that's not because he played bad at all. He was totally fine on the Ahri. He actually had a really good game, all things considered. I just think that the other players probably were a little bit more noteworthy in terms of the good plays that they ended up making. And I think that most applies to someone like Doran, who obviously really took over in the back half of this game on the Jax. He was their late game out, if you will. Him and the Viego were definitely the two champions that you draft in order to make sure that even if the Corki and the Diana and the Yasuo, all of them do start to get online and start to become a bit of a problem in the back half of the game, you have your ways out of it. I honestly kind of like T1's late game, like, just as much as I like HLE's, even though you do have, less, like, direct engage, just because I think you have more map options with the Jax and with, Viego or Ahri in a side lane or something like that. Caitlyn actually scales really well once you get like super late game. It's just like the mid game that she's really bad in. And so, I really don't dislike the idea for T1. And I think if you're going to rely on Doran to be able to step up and play that Jax at a high level, you're pretty lucky that he was able to kind of capitalize on that. You're not expecting him to take over early. Zeus was fine in the laning phase, and he was pretty good, I would say, throughout the entirety of the game, if not a bit ineffective across everything. He really was just answering a lot of the waves throughout the back half. Doran was the one just everywhere on the map that he needed to be, taking over and, just really creating panic, I would say, overall for HLE, not really giving them a lot of opportunities to have an answer. And so really happy for that. Again, we kind of criticized him, saying he needed to be the one to step up in this series, and he did exactly that to keep them alive here in game number 4. But you definitely should give shout-outs elsewhere. Owner was fantastic in the back half of this game. It really, is just clockwork at this point. He's the best smiter in the world, and it's not particularly close, but the Viego was very impactful in these fights as well. Smash and Keria were integral in the early game. Like, Delight actually had a pretty decent early game. I know you can look at the scoreline and be like, it doesn't necessarily look all that good for the support Elise, but that's mostly because, like, the Elise was just AFK throughout basically, like, 12 minutes onwards, and that's just the problem that champion runs into. Caitlyn and Karma, I think, were generally fine outside of that, even if I don't think they were stars. And then, like I said, Faker was still really good, played within the structure of the rest of the team, and realized that even though he's on Ahri, he doesn't have to be the main character of this game, and he wasn't, which was generally the right call, I would say, for T1. So good execution, good game plan, good game from T1. And then for HLE, again, I don't want to criticize them too much because I honestly think they played fine here, but this is pretty indicative of why I thought they wouldn't do well in like these best of fives against the best teams in the world, against the best teams in the LCK. And that's because while while you are getting good performances out of multiple players every single game, in this case, it was Peanut and Zeka, who I think both played really well on the Diana and the Yasuo, you're just not going to get that from the entire team, or you haven't been getting that from the entire team. Unfortunately, in this game, it was the bot lane that just completely let you down. Whether you want to give dud of the game to Viper or Delight, I think is entirely up to you. Delight was mega useless after 15 minutes especially. Like, genuinely, it felt like he was AFK, like just looking at something else, because he just wasn't doing anything. The champion itself couldn't really do anything, but at the end of the day, the reason I'm not giving him dud of the game is because he was at least useful early. Like, there were at least times where it felt like the Elise pick was doing something at the beginning of the game. I just don't think the Elise support pick in general is going to be good against the best teams in the world. I think we've kind of seen that already in the LCK with this champion not performing particularly well. You will have to be so much better than your opponent in order to make this work, and it's just hard to do that when you're, playing against T1. But I'm going to give dud of the game to Viper. Like, he was really bad in this game on the Corki, just mispositioning in a lot of pivotal areas, getting caught out, not really giving his team a chance to be able to win it. He did not have to play main character ball on the Corki in this game, and he went out and tried to do that. Like, Peanut and Zeka were clearly, like, the focal point where HLE wanted to put a lot of their resources, and Viper was just eliminating that opportunity, I would say, from them by playing the way that he did, by positioning the way that he did. It just was not a very good game overall. I don't think he's been particularly phenomenal in this series. Delight has done a lot of the heavy lifting in the laning phase 2v2s, and, we'll see how that moves forward, but again, like, you have to get a good performance from everybody. Zeus was stuck on wave catching duty, and Peanut and Zeka were the only two players that were attempting to do anything. This was a 2v8 in the back half of the game, and you know what? They tried. They had a really good game, and they played well on this combo. They just couldn't quite overcome the nature of the three other players on this team not being relevant. So now we move into game 5. Still a lot of good takeaways here for HLE. Peanut is playing really well, Zeka is playing really well, and you have to imagine you're not going to get that kind of performance out of Viper and Delight again. It's just really hard to project them to do that 2 games in a row. If they can just not pick something that is so finicky, a lane that I really don't like Corki and Elise, then I think they're gonna be fine, and T1 still has to keep their foot on the gas, but it's now a winner-take-all best of 1. Whoever wins this game 5 will be moving on to round 2. The loser will be done for the winter split, and that means they will not be going to first stand. So who's it gonna be? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to take this series 3-2. They will be moving on to the second round of the playoffs, and T1 is officially going to be eliminated here in 6th place in the winter split in the LCK Cup. A genuinely ridiculous outcome for a team that really only lost 2 series the entire split. Like, not like, oh really, but like actually only lost 2 series the whole split. They lose a best of 3 to D plus Kia, and they lose a best of 5 to Hanwha Life, and now all of a sudden you're 6th place. It's a genuinely ridiculous format and a genuinely ridiculous outcome here, but T1 is going to be the one eliminated. HLE will be the team moving forward, and you know what? We got a banger here in game number 5. This felt like it was in the bag for T1. It felt like the game was over. They were pushing 4 men onto the base, only 1 alive for HLE, and that is Peanut on the Amumu. And what does he do? He queues in and he clears the wave, and he buys enough time for HLE to be able to hold. From that point onwards, HLE is able to grab the Baron, they're able to start their push, and they're able to end the game because the Olaf just gets way too far out of control. It's honestly as poetic of a game number 5 as you could possibly ask for in a series like this, and it definitely lived up to expectations. I'm super excited to go over it, but let's talk about the players. Player of the game here for game 5, as well as player of the series as a whole, is going to go to Zeus for me on the top side. He wasn't the only player to play really well in this game for HLE. I gotta give a big shout out to Delight, who also had a phenomenal game on the Renata, but really at the end of the day, this couldn't go to anybody else, this player of the game, nor the player of the series could really go to anybody else. This was Zeus kind of putting HLE over the top, getting them across the finish line, and being the best player on the Rift. And we talked about it in the preamble. Doran had Zeus's number. I know I feel like I'm repeating myself a lot, but only so much I can talk about narrative-wise across 5 games. Zeus really needed to step up and prove that he could not only like hang with Doran in a best of 5 domestically from a mental standpoint, but like prove that he could like really turn up and dominate on Hanwha Life, which is not necessarily something he had done up up until this point, this split, and he was awesome in this series. He was a big reason why they won Game 1, a big reason why they won Game 5, and he was good in their losses as well. He never really was a problem or a major issue for this team. He just was very, very important for HLE throughout this series, and there's nobody that's going to be questioning whether or not he was making the biggest impact on game number 5. They could not kill the Olaf, and you know what? That's super relevant because look at the rest of this team. You don't have anybody else that can win you these fights 5v5 later on in the game. If Olaf is not super strong and kind of unkillable, if he can't just run into the backline and kill the Draven instantly, you don't really have a lot of ways to take down like Skarner plus Zoe and like Draven if he gets rolling, and you know, Akali is a bit of an issue for your backline. Like you don't have as many tools, in my opinion, as T1 has on the other side if Olaf is not able to just kind of break through the entire team. But that's exactly what he did here. Zeus was awesome. Unfortunately, Dud of the Game is actually also going to stay on Hanwha Life, even though he saved the game. I simply cannot give it to anyone other than Peanut in the jungle. This was, you know, a truly horrendous game number 5 performance from him on the Amumu. Most of it just comes down to weird decisions. Dude gets his first Heartsteel stack at like 33 minutes into the game. He ends the game with like 27 Heartsteel stacks on Amumu. It's something that felt completely incomprehensible to me at, you know, while I was watching this. And it's not like he performed particularly well outside of that, but it really just was him saving the game that, you know, kept them alive. And so how critical can I even be of him, even if the rest of the game from him wasn't particularly good? Everybody else, like I said, was fine. Zeka and Viper were good. They weren't necessarily stars, but they certainly were there to be able to facilitate Zeus being able to take over. But I think Delight is definitely the other player that you really have to shout out here. This guy is just so good. He was just better than Keria in this series, and I don't even really think it was all that close. I think he's making a strong argument that he is the best support in the entirety of the LCK. I think that that's a pretty reasonable thing to say. I think right now in terms of form, it really is him and Lehens, ironically enough, that I think are kind of fighting it out. Keria, I think, is still up there. He was good throughout this split. Just, you know, Delight was excellent, and he outplayed Keria in this series, which definitely kind of raises him up in that regard. But overall, it just was a fantastic series win for HLE, a necessary series win. If they had went out in 6th place themselves in this series, that would have been a pretty big disaster, and I think people would look back on the LCK Cup and the Winter Split in general as a major disappointment because it would have felt a lot more earned for HLE. For T1, we'll talk about it, but it feels like an absolute disservice to them that they are not only out of the tournament here, but out in 6th place because KT Rolster had the higher seeding, even though they had the worst record in the regular season. You know, whatever, right? Like, T1's gonna look back and not feel too bad about the LCK Cup, but if HLE had lost this, I don't think the narrative would have been quite as kind. I think a lot of people would be looking at them as a team that had very much regressed a lot from last year, and with this win, I think it really does solidify them still in the upper echelon of teams. But for T1 on the other side, this is a very disappointing outcome. Like, this is an unfair outcome if we're being entirely honest, not because they lose to HLE. Like, them losing this series is not the unfair part. The fact that they are out in 6th place is the unfair part after, again, only losing one series before this the entirety of the Winter Split. That being said, I like their draft. Again, I think you have a lot of options here. I really like the creativity we're seeing in like individual lane counter picks in full Fearless, having to pull something like Zoe out for Faker. Not that that's like a crazy pick or anything, but Zoe's not particularly meta, but she is very good into Talia, and that does open up a lot more opportunities for T1 to be able to play around the middle of the map. Somehow, some way, they're able to get Skarner on red side here in game number 5. That's definitely not what I anticipated, but they want to go for Smash on Draven. They want to go for trying to enable him with Keria playing the Soraka. It's a very clear identity that they want to go for here. They just couldn't end the game. It felt like they had full control. But once again, it feels like T1 kind of falling into the do nothing and lose category. Not that it was entirely as bad as it was in game number 1, but this is one of those situations where you had all of the pressure coming out, even though you weren't able to end in that, you know, game-winning situation. Why are you giving over Barons? Why are you not even attempting to contest for a lot of these major objectives in the back half of the game? Why are you allowing HLE to get themselves back into it, allowing, you know, the Olaf to be able to ramp up and making his job a lot easier? I just don't really understand the inaction from T1. I think from a shot calling perspective, they just need to get more aggressive. They are way too passive right now, and that's the reason they lost this series, was their shot calling in the back half of these games. But I can't even really point to individual underperformances. It's the reason I gave Peanut Dud of the game. It's because nobody on T1 really, like, played awful. Like, you had Owner playing fine on the Skarner, Faker played well on the Zoe, Smash and Keria did their thing on the Draven and the Soraka, even even if the Draven wasn't particularly useful in the back half of this game because Olaf could just run at him. That's not his fault. And the Draven was still useful in the early game. And Doran, I thought, was fine on the Akali. Again, even if he wasn't as relevant as you would want from an R5 top laner. Overall, like, I can't point to a player on T1 that really played awful and lost them the game or anything like that. It was more so just their decision-making and just the general vibe of the team in this series that really cost them. If they had played more aggressive in the back half of this game, they're probably walking out of here with a win, and that's just the unfortunate circumstance of it. But T1 officially eliminated here in 6th place. They will be done. They will not be going to first stand. HLE will be moving on. We'll talk about the selections in the second half. Big shocker. DK does not want to play Hanwha Life Esports, and I don't think anybody would want to play whoever won this series out of these two teams. And so HLE is definitely still going to have a challenge moving into the next round, but if you can beat T1, you can probably beat anybody at this point. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LCK Cup round number 1 overview and analysis video of the winter playoffs. We have our top four teams, I guess you can call them. Nongshim and Hanwha Life, of course, moving on from round number 1. You had selection here from D plus Kia as the number 1 seed. They got to choose which of those two teams they would rather face in round number 2, and to the surprise of absolutely no one, they chose Nongshim. And so in round number 2, it will be D plus Kia taking on Nongshim RedForce, and it will be Gen G taking on Hanwha Life Esports in a rematch of the finals from last summer. Very excited to talk about that. We'll preview these very quickly. DK versus Nongshim is a very easy preview and prediction. This should not be a difficult series for D plus Kia. I gave Nongshim a very big chance to win against KT, even if I didn't favor them. This is not the same circumstance. This is a very different situation and opportunity. DK looks like the best team in the world at the current moment, certainly the most consistent team in the world at the current moment. Their mid jungle looks genuinely unstoppable. Barrel, I think, has really unlocked this team, and Aiming and Siwoo are great 4th and 5th pieces. Like, they're unbelievably good 4th and 5th pieces, and so DK looks like they're just kind of on a warpath right now, and if they were facing a team like Gen G or HLE, maybe the conversation would be a bit different, but if they're facing anybody outside of that top 4, it just doesn't feel like they're going to be contested all that much. I would expect this to be a 3-0. Maybe Lahens pulls out some absolutely special mystery sauce, but oh my god, Showmaker versus Fisher, I just do not think is going to be very good for Nongshim in the middle of the map. So I would expect DK to not really have any trouble at all with this series, expect to sweep. And then for Gen G versus HLE, this is by far the more interesting of the two. Again, like I said, this is a rematch of summer finals from last year where Hanwha Life were able to get one over on Gen G. I don't know if that's going to happen again here. This is a much more interesting matchup than I was anticipating because we thought T1 was going to be moving on. If T1 had won that series and won game number 5, I probably would favorite them in this series, which makes me kind of want to favor Hanwha Life in this series. Not that Gen G has really been all that bad. They've just not been dominant in the same way that I was expecting. A couple of players have really not started out all that hot for Gen G. I think Canyon has really had some struggles at the start of this year. I think generally speaking, Keen has not been particularly good on the top side at the start of this year. Like, there are real concerns with Gen G. I think HLE has a real shot to be able to pick up a win here, especially because we know they can, but it's just hard to bet against a team that I had higher in my preseason power rankings. For now, I'm going to stick to that analysis and look at the rosters and say that Gen G should be better if you get the best version of them, but like I said in my comment section, them having 2 weeks off and not having played any stage games, and Hanwha Life now having regained all of their confidence, going through DRX in a best of 3 and going through T1 in a best of 5, like, they're the hotter team coming into this. They have more momentum than a team like Gen G. I would not be surprised at all if Hanwha Life was able to take this, but Gen G very narrowly is going to be my favorite here. It's genuinely a 50-50. Whoever you want to give the favorite to, I think that that's entirely fair, but let me know if you agree or disagree with those predictions down in the comment section below. Do you think it will be DK and Gen G? Do you think it will be DK and Hanwha Life? Do you, for some reason, think that Nongshim has, like, a favorite's chance to beat D plus Kia? Would love to know your thoughts and opinions down below, but that's gonna do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we'll be covering the rest of the LCK Cup playoffs here, the winter playoffs, and, first stands right around the corner. We will be covering that tournament as well, but LPL is back. LEC and LTA coverage is going to the playoffs now. We're going to be covering everything on this channel as we normally do. If you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all